Unabashed.
The most unpredictable
Becomes a headline.
the most volatile,
Outrageous behavior.
unsubstantiated narratives.
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. On February 14th, 2019, a suicide bomber crashed into an Indian paramilitary convoy in Pulwama, Kashmir, killing 40 Indian soldiers. The attack was the deadliest assault on Indian security personnel in Kashmir in 3 decades and captured the attention of domestic and international headlines. It also led to a nationalist fervor that fueled, in part, the BJP's dramatic re-election just months later in the 2019 elections. But how did the attack take place? Who were the masterminds of the operation? And how does this attack fit into a decades-long story of terrorism, militancy, and spycraft that has come to define the contemporary politics of Kashmir? These questions are clinically addressed in a new book by the journalist Rahul Pandita, The Lover Boy of Bahawalpur, How the Pulwama Case Was Cracked. Rahul previously joined me in August 2019 to discuss the politics in Kashmir and the wake of the nullification of Article 370. I am pleased to have him back on the program. Rahul, good to have you again.
Thank you, Milan. I'm glad to be back.
So I want to ask you to begin by taking us back to that fateful day. It was Valentine's Day, 2019, the day of the Pulwama attack. Some of our listeners may recall it. Some of them may have been unaware. In the book, you have reconstructed the events of that day in meticulous detail. Tell us about how the attack unfolded on the ground.
So it was a rather gloomy winter day in Kashmir, Milan, and it had been snowing quite a bit for about a week or so, due to which the national highway that connects Kashmir with the rest of India had been closed. And on that day, the convoys carrying Indian soldiers to their duty stations in Kashmir from mainland India had resumed after more than a week's gap. So obviously there was some rush, and there had been some rather vague intelligence inputs about the possibility of a VBIED attack or a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device attack. But like I said, the intelligence was not actionable at all. So basically, the security grid in Kashmir was clueless about the fact that a conspiracy of this level was being hatched and was about to be executed. And then the attack happened. This young Kashmiri man who drove a blue-colored car into bus number 5 in the convoy, and the impact of the blast, it was carrying about 200 kilos of explosives. Some of it are the deadly explosive RDX and some of it other explosives, which resulted in the killing of 40 soldiers. And it was a gruesome sight because the intensity of the attack was such that most of these soldiers were blown to pieces. And it left everyone stunned and shocked for, 10, 15 minutes. Nobody could react at all among the convoy. And all you could recover from the spot for hundreds of meters was essentially body parts of these soldiers. But even after the Kashmiri suicide bombers video was released about 15 minutes after the attack, hardly anyone in the Kashmir security grid could believe that a Kashmiri terrorist could have done it because, there was hardly any, almost no precedent of a Kashmiri suicide bomber except one in 2000. What is more perplexing for me is that for months till India's premier investigation agency, the National Investigation Agency, kind of connected the dots. No one knew about the presence of the mastermind, Umar Farooq in Kashmir. Farooq is Jaish-e-Mohammed Chief Masood Azhar's nephew. He was, in fact, or the fact that he was killed in Kashmir just a month and a half after the attack. It is only much later that the whole story is sort of unraveled.
Before we get deeper into the book, Rahul, I want to ask you about method. I imagine that reporting this book was no easy task, especially given the security lockdown in Kashmir in the wake of the events of August 2019. And then, of course, you had a lockdown within a lockdown because you had the COVID pandemic. You had limited physical mobility, limited access. How did you report this book?
It was tough, really. But what sort of helped my case was that I covered Kashmir almost like a daily beat. Kashmir and the Maoist heartland in eastern India are two areas I kind of keep an eye on because I think I have a personal stake of sorts in these two areas. I'm from Kashmir and have spent years traveling in the Maoist affected areas, sometimes for weeks embedded with Maoist guerrillas. So when Pulwama happens, I know that it is the deadliest attack to have happened in Kashmir in its 3 decades of bloodied history. But there is one moment, especially when the story becomes too close and kind of sharp in my heart. And I think this story needs to be followed more diligently. A few weeks after the incident, I'm traveling through the area, through the spot of the attack with a small unit of the Indian Army. And among this unit are a few young officers of military intelligence. And these young officers were among the first response team to reach the spot, basically minutes after the attack took place. And one of the officers described that attack to me, what he first saw when he reached that spot. So it's a double road. And on one side of the road, there's a small hillock of sorts, and there are a few communication towers on that hillock. So he told me that the intensity of the blast was such that he found the mangled remains of 4 paramilitary soldiers dangling over that communication tower. So a part of my journalism, over the past 2 decades is also about the fact that, when I go to some of these areas, like the Maoist heartland, there's, I personally make an attempt to kind of give faces to these statistics, when you say 40 CRPF soldiers have died. So who are these 40 CRPF soldiers? What life they had, what ambition, dreams, their families, and under what circumstances did they find themselves in Kashmir? So I kind of started following this story more diligently, and I thought to myself that it perhaps deserves much more than a 3,000 word, 4,000 word news report.
Rahul, I think it might be useful for some of our listeners to provide a bit of broader context, right? Because the Kashmir of 2019 was very different from the Kashmir of 2014 or even of 2004 or even of 2000, right? You note that in the mid-2000s, from the perspective of the rank and file soldier, Kashmir was seen as the quote-unquote safe posting because the real fight was against left-wing extremists in the Red Corridor, the fight against Maoist guerrillas. But then by 2015, the situation had reversed itself. The Maoist insurgency had been not defeated, but certainly was in decline. But things in Kashmir began to heat up. What exactly changed over that decade-long period where essentially these two positions switched themselves?
So to answer this question, I think I'll have to draw a little map of insurgency in Kashmir for our listeners. And I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. So insurgency begins in 1989-90 with this militant organization called Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, comprising of Kashmiri boys who are asking for azadi or freedom from Kashmir. And they're clear about their other goals, namely the ouster of Kashmir's minuscule Hindu population, or the Kashmiri Pandits. About 700 of them are brutally massacred, hunted down in their homes, offices, shops. There's also a lot of euphoria in Kashmir at that point in time because the might of the Indian state has collapsed. There is an absolute paralysis. Many in the local police are also sympathetic to Islamist extremists. But what happens quickly is that JKLF, or the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, is quickly replaced by Hizbul Mujahideen by Pakistan. And it talks clearly about merger of Kashmir with Pakistan. And by 93, 94, lots of Afghan war veterans are in Kashmir, battling it out with Indian forces. But the war is more or less over. The Kashmiri militant leadership understands that separation from the Union of India will remain an utopia. So they get more interested in cutting deals with Indian agencies and Pakistani agencies. Everyone is sort of making money, taking advantage of this intelligence agency's thirst for asset building. So everyone is being employed by this agency or that as a potential asset. And then in the late 90s, the Kargil war happens between India and Pakistan. Pakistan is defeated. Towards the end of 99, IC-814 hijacking takes place, resulting in the release of Masood Azhar and Omar Sheikh and one more terrorist.
And we'll come back to that because that is a critical moment.
Absolutely. So immediately afterwards, in 2000, Jaish is formed by Masood Azhar. So we see another phase of terrible violence in Kashmir. There's a deadly attack on the Kashmir Legislative Assembly, as deadly as the Pulwama attack. There's a parliament attack of 2001, and so on and so forth.
And Rahul, just to be clear, Jaish-e-Mohammed is a terrorist organization which finds safe haven in Pakistan, which many people have argued has direct links with the Pakistani ISI or intelligence establishment. Is that right?
Yes. So no, the cycle of violence kind of continues through the early 2000s. Till the death in 2003 in Kashmir of the dreaded Jaish commander Ghazi Baba, about whom I have written in detail about the circumstances under which he was killed and what he tried to do in Kashmir. He was the mastermind of the parliament attack in India. After Ghazi Baba's death, the Jaish infrastructure and network is kind of destroyed in Kashmir. And by the middle of 2000s, 2006-07, peace returns to Kashmir. And as a Kashmiri, I felt for the first time as a reporter going to Kashmir since 1998. And as a reporter, I've witnessed terrible things in Kashmir. In those days, I was young and reckless and did not fully understand the journalistic difference of, the crossing of line between what you call guts and stupidity. So I've done some reckless things in those in those days. And this is a time when none of us had any clue about the possibility or even the existence of things like PTSD, etc. So coming back to the Srinagar city, the main city in Kashmir, is declared free of terrorists. Several other districts are also declared terrorist free. But by 2008, Pakistan and separatist elements in Kashmir changed their gear. They want to show again that the so-called resistance movement in Kashmir is indigenous. So a new phase of stone pelting or intifada, as many Kashmiri writers in American universities like to call it, begins. So till 2014, there's this blow hot, blow cold. There are many episodes where, these young men are fighting pitched battles with Indian security forces. There comes into existence the idea of pellet guns, and there are the pictures of people who have been hit with these pellet guns are all over the international press and so on and so forth. And then Mr. Modi comes to power in 2014. And now everyone in Kashmir thinks that, oh God, the Hindu nationalist government is here. Now things will change drastically. But the BJP goes and makes an alliance with a soft separatist political party in Kashmir called the PDP. And many in Kashmir joke about this alliance. They call it an alliance between the RSS and Hizbul Mujahideen. Hizbul Mujahideen because there is credible evidence that the PDP uses the help of Jamaat Islamic cadre to win elections in Kashmir, and Hizbul Mujahideen is the armed wing of Jamaat Islami. And then, the episode of Burhan Wani happens in 2016. And Kashmir is plunged into a civil war of sorts. And that is where the whole scenario changes. But from 2016-17 onwards, the entire scenario changes, and it becomes very similar to what the paramilitary soldiers faced in Kashmir in the 90s.
So this is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important. In 2015, as you mentioned, there were state assembly elections. The BJP of Mr. Modi struck up an unlikely political alliance with the People's Democratic Party, or PDP, to form the government in Jammu and Kashmir. It was the first time the BJP was a part of the governing apparatus. At the same time, as you just said, the PDP had credible links to separatist groups operating in the state, which the BJP has been very vocal in opposing. So I'm trying to understand here, why would a Hindu nationalist party, which has long wanted to integrate Kashmir into the Union, something they ended up doing formally with the abrogation of Article 370 in August 2019, why would they dip their toe into these waters and align themselves with a group that was encouraging or providing aid and succor to separatist elements? Because we now know one of the justifications of nullifying Article 370 was the fact that it essentially emboldened separatist elements, right? Many of the PDP leaders who the BJP had joined hands with were placed under house arrest. So how do we think about this political alliance that was going on at the time?
The shortest possible answer to this question is that BJP, Mr. Modi's government, time and again in the last 7 years, has committed this terrible mistake of conflating their electoral strategy or electoral gains with national interest. This is what we see time and again, even in the government's poor handling of COVID crisis in the second round, where you had rallies after rallies happening in the middle of this COVID crisis, with Prime Minister Modi attending them, these rallies themselves, and addressing these rallies and saying that, I've never seen such crowds in a political rally before. And in the same evening, chairing a meeting on how to tackle the COVID crisis. So, for the same greed, for the same benefit of gaining this electoral power, it made this Himalayan blunder, really, of making an alliance with the People's Democratic Party. But in 2014, when the so-called Hindu nationalist government is supposed to bring a remarkable change in the way we look at Kashmir, it goes ahead and, for the sake of this sheer political power, embraces the same people whom it has called villains in the past, and after the break of this alliance, continues to call them villains, and, like you rightly pointed out, after the abrogation, puts them under detention for weeks and months.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is you make in the book an explicit link between the hijacking of Indian Airlines Flight 814 and the Pulwama attacks. Now, IC-814, many of our listeners will recall, was a flight headed from Kathmandu to Delhi. It was hijacked by 5 masked men, forced to land in Kandahar, Afghanistan, which was then under the control of the Taliban. In order to free the hostages on that flight, India agreed to release 3 well-known terrorists from Indian prisons. This was seen at the time as a humiliating setback for the government. We should just mention that the current National Security Advisor was an important protagonist in this affair. What does any of this have to do with Pulwama?
So, like I mentioned earlier, Milan, that in the 90s, in the early 90s, hundreds of these Afghan Mujahideen are sent by Pakistan's ISI to fight in Kashmir. So in the early 90s, a man called Nasrullah Mansoor Langrial is sent. He's an Afghan war veteran and a personal friend of Ilyas Kashmiri, who was a former Pakistan Special Forces person and the leader of Huji or Harkatul Jihad Islami. And Kashmiri was killed in a US drone strike in northwest Pakistan in 2011. Now, Langrial comes to Kashmir in 93 and in a stroke of bad luck for him, is arrested by the Indian Army in the November of 1993. And for Pakistan and its forces fighting, these mercenaries fighting its war in Kashmir, it is a major setback. So the ISI sends another Afghan war veteran with the name of Sajjad Afghani to kind of take steps to ensure the release of Nasrullah Langrial. Now, Afghani, is a reckless warrior, and he goes a little out of control. He kidnaps an Indian Army officer and executes him in cold blood, etc. And then to kind of control him, Pakistan sends immediately afterwards Masood Azhar. Now, as luck would have it, Masood Azhar also, in a stroke of bad luck, is arrested just days after he lands in South Kashmir, because a small three-wheeler or an auto rickshaw in which he's traveling with Sajjad Afghani breaks down in the middle of a market square, and he's picked up by the Indian Army and the BSF. They have absolutely no idea how important he is, but then later they know who Masood Azhar is. Now, with the arrest of Masood Azhar, Pakistan becomes kind of more and more restless. And as you remember, in 1995, the Harkatul Jihad Islami, under the name of Al-Farah, kidnaps 6 foreign tourists in Kashmir. Now, after that, 99 happens, and Masood Azhar is freed in the release of, in exchange of the passengers of the ill-fated IC-814, and he immediately creates Jaish-e-Mohammed. Now, Langrial is repatriated to Pakistan sometime in 2011. How and why, there's absolutely no clarity about it. Masood forms, as we know, the Jaish in 2000, recruits Ghazi Baba. He builds a great, invincible infrastructure around him. Now, coming back to Pulwama, why Ghazi Baba's story is important and the story of IC-814 is important? Because it is in many ways the same network Umar Farooq, the mastermind of the Pulwama attack, uses when he plans Pulwama attack.
I mean, it's a remarkable full circle, Rahul, and it reminds me a lot of, the writings of Steve Cull on Afghanistan and the U.S. Support for the Mujahideen, many of whom then come back, right, and are protagonists in a different war at a different time. Of course, at that point, not working with the United States, but against the United States. I want to ask you about a different character, and it's an important character, although one who has a brief appearance by virtue of his terrorist acts. The suicide bomber in Pulwama was a Kashmiri young man named Adil Dar. He was an Indian national who had become radicalized. He emerged as a Jaish foot soldier in Kashmir. How significant is it, do you think, that Dar was not a foreign fighter, that he was a Kashmiri? And what do we exactly know about the specific factors in his case that led him to take up arms against the Indian state?
It's a typical story from Kashmir, which we have seen repeated time and again over the last many, many years. Adil Dar is from South Kashmir. He's essentially from Pulwama itself. He used to live just a few miles off the spot where he rammed this explosive-laden car into the convoy. And, the police calls it a typical demography that attracts young Kashmiri Muslim boys to terrorist groups. It's a family with very little education, already some sort of radicalization. There are a few relatives, uncles, cousins who are already a part of this terrorist group or that terrorist group. As a boy is sent to a madrasa nearby. From madrasa, he turns into a stone pelter and then, into a chronic stone pelter. And then an overground worker of a terrorist organization, which according to police is a natural transition for many men like Adil Dar. It is only when he comes in touch with Umar Farooq, when he turns into this hardcore jihadi, willing to give away his life. Now, Umar is not an ordinary terrorist. He has been trained in the best joint jihadi facilities of Al-Qaeda and Jaish and Taliban, in the Sangin camp of Afghanistan's Helmand province. He knows how to influence young men like Adil. So the moment he sets his eyes upon Adil, he knows that this is going to be his man. So Adil Dar, like he's been trained in the best facilities, is isolated from the rest of the people. He is repeatedly made to listen to the speeches of Sheikh, as they call Masood Azhar, where he's kind of beseeching urging the Kashmiri men to rise against the atrocities of the Indian state and so on and so forth. Till the time he, as I described vividly in my book, till the time he actually rams this car, by this time he is almost scared of Umar Farooq, because he knows that he will have perhaps a more slow and gory death if he does not follow the diktats of Umar Farooq, and he prefers the other death. And like I write in my book, when he's going, he's very nervous. His hands are trembling. But I think by the time he's mature enough to understand that there's no going back for him, there's no return for him.
I want to fast forward from February 14, 2019, just a couple of weeks later, when the Indian Air Force targeted a Jaish-e-Mohammed training camp in Balakot, Pakistan, which was, of course, retaliation for the suicide attack. Now, this has been one of the most contested strikes in recent Indian history. Pakistan has long claimed that Indian forces hit nothing but a bunch of trees. The Indian government, for its part, proudly announced that it had neutralized scores of terrorists. What did you learn from your reporting about what actually happened in Balakot that day?
So Balakot is not does not form the main core of my story about Pulwama, but it's of course an essential milestone in my story. So I've made a brief mention of the entire episode. In my experience,
including the fact that Indian intelligence, the RNAW, had a human source there on the ground who helped to identify the camp.
I realized that both sides are basically exaggerated. And like I write in my book, immediately on the same evening when this incident happens, when this terrorist attack happens, the government of India makes up its mind to kind of strike back at Pakistan. Now there are many options. Just a few years back, they've done this symbolic so-called surgical strike in Uri in response to a terrorist attack along the line of control in Kashmir. So the research and analysis wing gives that as part of the option, but the government rejects it completely, because they don't want this to be another symbolic act. They want this to be what you call crossing a Rubicon of sorts, right? Then other options are found, and then the third target, which seems very viable to Mr. Modi and his government, and it's a Jaish training camp on a hilltop in a place called Balakot. So first, the intelligence bureau is asked to, kind of directed to send the coordinates of this particular camp. I think they take about 3 days and then they come up with coordinates, but those coordinates are wrong. So that is when the RAW sends one of its human assets to the particular place. And like my source told me that he was carrying a mobile phone in his upper pocket of his shirt, which kind of beamed a live video of the area to a facility in Delhi. And then the government decides to, there are other reasons, there's one of the assets somewhere in a neutral country tells them about the history of Balakot and the fact that in 1831, that the Sikh ruler Maharaja Ranjit Singh, his troops had killed this man called Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, a man, whose dreams of establishing an Islamic caliphate preceded those of organizations like ISIS, etc. So, for a government like Mr. Modi's, the historical symbolism of it, the place also works very well. So this happens. But now this is where the exaggeration ends. My sources have told me that the facility was hit, but they have absolutely no idea about how many casualties took place. I think the Pakistan authorities were smart enough to kind of disperse many injured, not put them in one particular hospital, send them across to many hospitals. And some of the assets which were there from Indian side could not ascertain for sure how many casualties have happened. But of course, in those days, the television channels, they just randomly picked up a number. If my memory serves me right, I think it was 300. And the government never denied it. And, they kind of stuck to that argument. And, it is something which suited their narrative as well. But as far as my research is concerned, I think the ammunition, the missiles, they were able to hit the target, but the government has absolutely no idea how many casualties took place.
So, Rahul, I'd like to ask you, if you could, to sort of bring the narrative up to the present day. Towards the end of the book, you write that Pakistani-based terrorist groups, they're now using things like drones to send weapons into India. Groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed may be using Nepal rather than Pakistan as a way of infiltrating India. So as you kind of step back and think about Kashmir, a place you know so well, a place that you call home, what does the nature of the terror threat in Kashmir look like in 2021?
It's a very complex question, Milan, really. So let's begin with this new threat of drones. Now, we've seen in the past year or so, especially, the Pakistani agencies' extensive use of very sophisticated drones. These are basically Chinese-made powerful quadricopters, which are used to carry ammunition, and in case of Punjab, even drugs across the international border with complete impunity. And these drones have the capability of landing many, many miles inside the Indian territory, and where, the particular coordinates of that particular landing are already given to terrorist groups, and there is someone already waiting at that particular pre-designated spot, and then, whatever these drones are carrying is picked up and ultimately finds its way to Jammu and Kashmir. So it is a very credible threat. And unfortunately, so far, I visited the Samba sector along the international border in Jammu, where most of these infiltration by drones take place. This is also the particular sector where Pakistan has dug these really, really sophisticated tunnels through which people like Umar Farooq and his men have infiltrated time and again into the territory. And from there, a sympathizer or an overground worker picks them up and then transports them to Kashmir. And these tunnels are really engineering mounds. And sadly, so far as this drone technology is concerned, the government seems to have absolutely no strategy how to deal with it. This has been flagged time and again, but in a very old fashion, the government wakes up when things are already on fire. So I think now they're kind of waking up to that threat. But having said that, things look a little dicey back in Kashmir. You must have followed the recent killings of members of minority community in Kashmir. Now, the new threat is these nameless overground workers who are hardly trained, but they don't need any training to kill an innocent outsider, as they call them in Kashmir, someone who's from mainland India or someone who belongs to the minority communities of Sikhs or Hindus. You just need a pistol and a body cam, and you go and engage in this particular crime. And these are mostly, as far as our information is coming, mostly overground workers who are new recruits, and it is difficult for police to catch them because they have no record. They are sort of under radar as of now. The other big challenge is the mushrooming of small units of IS in Kashmir. We know for sure that in the past few months, at least one big unit module of ISIS has been busted in South Kashmir with the help of FBI. The FBI team was here several times. There are senior investigating officers from India's agencies who have recently been to the United States, and they are cooperating about the existence of these modules in South Kashmir. So that is going to be another big challenge which we will witness in Kashmir in the coming days.
Rahul, let me ask you one last thing before I let you go. With the American exit from Afghanistan, many voices in the government or who are sympathetic to the government have noted with some degree of glee, I guess you could say, that the decision to nullify Article 370 and thereby gain the upper hand in Kashmir, in retrospect, looks like a pretty prescient move. Without getting into the merits, demerits of the 370 decision, let me just ask you this. Do you think the Union government today is better positioned to neutralize possible terrorist threats, whether they be external, internal, than it was back in February of 2019?
The answer is a mix of gray, really, Milan, and I'll explain how. You remember our conversation after the abrogation of Article 370, and I just returned from Kashmir after a trip in the middle of this essential, big crackdown. And I was speaking to a number of police officers or investigators who work in Kashmir, and they were absolutely happy. And they were making a joke about the fact that now they do not have to report to anyone like Mr. Mufti Muhammad Saeed, who will ask them to, a local small-time politician will pick up his phone and then direct them to release this overground worker, which they've arrested after a lot of hard work. And as some of the police officers joked to me, my old friends, they said, now we can do anything because Mr. Amit Shah is our boss. He's directly our boss. So initially, after the abrogation, I think some parts of how to deal with, old deep state of insurgency in Kashmir, some work was done. I think in terms of dismissing of employees who have government employees who have ties with separatist groups and militant organizations, some steps like that were big steps. But somewhere down the line, I felt that there is some basic flaw in the counter-insurgency model we are following in Jammu and Kashmir. And allow me a minute to explain this, because even after 30 years of fighting militancy and killing scores, hundreds of terrorists, even after 30 years, if the success of your counterinsurgency model is based on the fact that in X number of months you have killed X number of boys, then I think, as an old student of Kashmir, as an old student of counterinsurgency, I think there is something wrong with that model. Because as we know from the life stories of people like Adil Dar, there is never going to be any sort of dearth of young Kashmiri men who want to take up this path. I think the success of this counterinsurgency model now, after 30 years, should be the fact that you are making some attempts to hit at the fountainhead, at the source of this radical jihad, which means that you're dismantling the very strong network of radical organizations like Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the Kashmir equivalent of Muslim Brotherhood. But officers who have of late been dealing with Kashmir in the post 370 abrogation of 370 scenario are sometimes frustrated because they think that people who take decisions in New Delhi do not understand the dangers and perils of radical Islam. But the deeper problems in Kashmiri society remains. The Kashmir of 2021, I'm afraid, is much more radicalized than the Kashmir of 2021.
My guest on the show this week is the journalist Rahul Pandita. He is the author most recently of the book, The Lover Boy of Bahawalpur, How the Pulwama Case Was Cracked, published by Juggernaut Press. This book not only provides an intricate examination of the Pulwama attack, but it actually just links so many disparate strands of terrorism, militancy, politics, that will make your head spin, the number of connections that are made. Rahul, thank you so much for taking the time, and congrats again on the book.
Thank you, Milan. I'm glad to be here again, and it was wonderful having this conversation with you again.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff J. Pranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.